The Alvarez salt flats had no color left in them. Whatever the war had done to the land east of the border crossing, the burning, the shelling, the chemical runoff that nobody in the after-action reports ever named properly, it had taken color away first. The ground was white. The sky above it, bleached by afternoon heat, was nearly white. The low ridge lines in the distance, what few of them remained, had gone the color of old bone. Sergeant First Class Dale Rourke stood at the edge of the convoy's lead vehicle and looked out at it and said nothing. He had been in the desert before. Multiple deserts, multiple tours, but this one sat differently on his chest. This one had a quality he could not name, the way the light bounced off the salt surface at angles that weren't quite right, the way sound seemed to arrive half a second late, like an echo of itself. "Command wants confirmation we're still on schedule," said Corporal Jess Hartley from the passenger seat. The SATCOM unit pressed to his ear. "Tell command we're on schedule. We've got less than 4 hours of clean visibility." "I know how long 4 hours is, Hartley." The convoy was 6 vehicles, 41 personnel. Their mission, as it had been explained to Rourke in a briefing room that smelled of burned coffee and bad decisions, was to reach grid reference 779er and confirm the status of a listening post that had gone dark 48 hours prior. Simple reconnaissance. Evaluate. Report. Extract. Nobody said the word ambush in that briefing room. Nobody had to. Rourke turned from the windshield and walked back along the convoy line. He passed Corporal Tatum Briggs, who was adjusting the mount on the second vehicle's gun and whistling something low and tuneless. He passed Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 26 years old, fresh out of Fort Benning, the kind of officer whose uniform was too clean for where they were. He passed the comms specialist, Private Donahue, who was on his 3rd attempt to run a diagnostics check on equipment that had started behaving strangely the moment they'd crossed into the dead zone. "Still nothing?" Rourke asked. "I've got noise," Donahue said. "But it's not signal. The salt surface is doing something to the frequency bounce. I've never seen it this bad. How long to fix it? That depends on whether it can be fixed out here." Rourke moved on. Near the rear of the convoy, standing apart from the main cluster of soldiers, was the trainee. He had been told her name. He had heard it once and not retained it, which told him something about how seriously he had taken her presence. She was 23, maybe 24. She wore her uniform with the slightly too careful look of someone who had recently been issued it. Her kit was correctly assembled and correctly positioned, which meant she had studied how to assemble and position it rather than done it enough times for the arrangement to become automatic. She carried her rifle with the careful grip of a person who respected the weapon rather than the easy familiarity of someone who had carried one daily for years. She was standing at the rear edge of the convoy, not looking at the other soldiers. She was looking at the flats. Specifically, she appeared to be looking at a point roughly 40 degrees northeast, where there was nothing visible except the white salt and the white sky meeting in a line that wavered slightly in the heat shimmer. "Trainee," Rourke said. She turned. Her eyes were calm in a way he noticed and didn't know what to do with. "You're with Webb's fire team today. Don't get separated." "Understood, Sergeant." He walked away. Behind him, she turned back to look at the northeast again. Then she looked at the shadow, her own body cast on the salt, observing the angle of it. Then she looked at the ridge to the southwest. She did not take out a compass. She already knew where north was. Her name was Clara Voss. That detail was in the file that nobody had read carefully, the transfer papers that had come through 3 days ago with a classification level that was oddly high for a trainee, and a service history that seemed to end abruptly in the middle of a sentence, like a book with the last chapter torn out. Private First Class Clara Voss, attached for field assessment. Report to Sergeant First Class Rourke. The soldiers of 3rd Platoon had their own theories, the way soldiers always do when someone new and quiet shows up in their unit. Briggs thought she was a reporter embedded undercover, some kind of journalist doing a piece on women in combat roles. The thought annoyed him. He kept a careful distance. Hartley, who was younger and more generous, thought she might be a psych evaluator of some kind, sent to observe the unit under operational conditions. He tried, twice, to engage her in conversation. Both times she answered briefly and without hostility and did not expand on her answers, and Hartley found himself walking away having said much more than she had. Webb thought she was exactly what her papers said she was, a trainee in over her head, someone's favor gone wrong, a administrative problem that had somehow become his problem. He assigned her the rear position in his fire team and did not think about her again. None of them watched her move. In the early part of the convoy advance, when the vehicles slowed, and the fire teams dismounted to check a section of ground where the surface looked uncertain. Clara Voss walked the way a person walks when they have learned the hard way that the ground does not always hold. Not slow, not hesitant. Deliberately placed, weight distributed, feet angled slightly outward on the crusted salt, eyes moving in a pattern that was not random. She read the terrain the way some people read faces. Near the midpoint of the advance, when the convoy paused for a water and equipment check, she crouched beside a section of salt surface and pressed 2 fingers gently against it. She looked at the depression her fingers made. She looked at the way the light fell across it from the west. She straightened and oriented herself again, checking 3 things in a specific sequence: the shadow of the ridge, the angle of the sun, the pattern of the wind in the fine salt crystals that skittered across the surface near her boots. Hartley, happening to glance her way, thought she was just resting. She was not resting. She had noticed something about the way the light was behaving 30 degrees east of their current heading. She had been noticing it since they crossed the first salt field. The reflection angle was wrong, not wrong in the way haze does it, not wrong in the way heat shimmer does it, wrong in a specific way that she had seen before, in a different desert, a long time ago, when she was not yet Clara Voss but someone else entirely. She considered saying something. She decided not to. Not yet. She was new to this unit. She was a trainee. She had no standing from which to say what she suspected, and what she suspected, if she was wrong, would sound like the anxious imagination of someone who didn't belong here. She filed it away and kept walking. 40 meters ahead, the convoy pushed deeper into the white. The listening post at grid reference 779er was real. It was a 4-meter square concrete installation, low profile, built into a natural depression in the salt that made it nearly invisible from more than 200 meters away. The antenna array on the north face was intact. The door was closed. The solar panel on the roof was functional. But the equipment inside had been wiped. Methodically. Professionally. Not destroyed, wiped. Every data module blank. Every recording device reset to factory state. Someone was here, Webb said, moving through the small interior with his rifle up and his voice carefully controlled. And they took their time. How long ago? Rourke asked from the doorway. 40 hours minimum. Maybe 60. Rourke stood in the doorway and looked out at the salt flats surrounding the installation and thought about the word minimum. All right, he said. Hartley, get me anything we can pull from command on the last known signal from this location. Donahue, try the long range again. Sergent. It was Voss. She was standing 6 meters from the installation, facing northwest, not looking at any of them. Not now, trainee. I know, she said, but you should look at the ridge at 270. Voss. The light is wrong on it. Her voice was the same as it always was. Flat, informational, neither requesting nor demanding. The reflection angle from the salt surface suggests there's something on that ridge that isn't part of the ridge. It's been there since we stopped. Rourke looked at her. Then he looked at the ridge at 270. It looked like a ridge. Low, salt white, broken. He looked away. Let's stay focused. Webb, I want. The shot came from the northeast. It was a single round, and it hit Donahue's equipment case instead of Donahue, which was either luck or a deliberate miss, and in the half-second after impact, Rourke's mind produced that word deliberate and locked it away to think about later, in the same moment that his body was already moving, already pulling people back toward the vehicles, already running the standard response protocol that training had made automatic. Contact northeast. Briggs called. Single shot. Can't locate. Inside. Get inside the vehicles. They moved. A second shot came 40 seconds after the first. This one was not a miss. Private Aaron Stiles went down hard with a hit to the upper thigh. Not dead, screaming, being dragged by 2 soldiers whose names Rourke kept thinking automatically as he moved. Gaines, pulling, Torres, covering. Then the comms went entirely dark. Not just degraded, gone. Rourke got into the lead vehicle and found what he expected to find. Nothing. Dead screens. Dead radio, dead GPS. Whatever was doing it had been doing it since they crossed the salt field, and now it had finished the job completely. He had 41 personnel, 2 wounded, no communication with command, and a sniper he could not locate. In the rearview mirror, he saw Clara Voss, standing beside the second vehicle, not running, looking northeast. Her face was doing something he couldn't fully read from that angle calculation. He thought later. The look of someone running numbers they had run before. The salt storm came from the southwest, which was the wrong direction. This was the first thing that told Rourke it was not an ordinary salt storm. In the Alvarez Flats, The prevailing weather patterns moved northwest to southeast, had moved that way for decades of recorded data. What rolled toward them across the white surface came from the opposite quadrant, and it moved with a speed and density that left perhaps 4 minutes of preparation time. Whiteout conditions, complete sensory erasure, wind speeds sufficient to strip the markings from equipment. Webb got the vehicles into a defensive cluster. Soldiers took covered positions between and beneath them. The salt hit like a physical force, not sand, not dust, but fine crystalline particles that found every gap in goggles and face coverings, and stung with a cold that had no right to exist in a desert this hot. Rourke lost visual contact with 3/4 of his force within 40 seconds. "Sound off," he shouted into the white. Voices came back, ragged and scattered. 8, 12, 15, another shot, closer this time. Private Second Class Kellerman, hit in the shoulder, down, 3 wounded. The sniper was moving. Using the storm, that meant the sniper had known the storm was coming, had timed this, or had simply had enough experience with this particular dead zone to know its patterns in a way that Rourke, operating from a 3-day briefing and a dead GPS, did not. He could not see 10 meters. He could not reach command. He had no fix on the shooter. He pressed himself against the undercarriage of the lead vehicle and tried to construct a picture from what he had. The shot intervals, the positions of the wounded, the approximate line they fell on, the direction the second and third shots had come from. They didn't line up. The shooter was moving in a pattern that was not random but that he couldn't yet decode. Rourke. Clara Voss was beside him. He had not heard her approach. "I said not. I know where the shooter is." He looked at her face. The salt was hitting it the same as everyone else's. Her goggles were on. Her expression was the same expression it had been since she'd gotten out of the vehicle at the listening post. "The storm gives them no better visibility than us," she said. "They're not shooting by sight anymore. They're shooting by pattern. The shot intervals, the spacing, the angles, there's a sequence. I've been counting it. A sequence. Based on the angles I've been tracking since we entered the grid. The direction change between the second and third shots is 4.3 degrees. That matches movement along the low spine of the northeast ridge, heading south-southwest toward higher ground. They're climbing." Inapproximately, she looked at something he couldn't see, or perhaps just at the white air between them. 12 minutes they'll be at the elevated position. After that, the angle changes and the storm no longer covers them. Rourke stared at her. "Where are you getting 4.3 degrees?" he said. In a whiteout, she didn't answer that question. She looked at him with those calm, specific eyes and said, "Do you want to keep arguing, or do you want to do something about it?" What happened next happened through the platoon's secondary radio, the short-range unit that was still partially functional despite the interference functional enough for internal communication, if not for reaching command. Rourke keyed it. "All elements, this is Rourke. Hold positions. Do not advance. I have a possible fire solution in development." The voice that came back on the channel was Webb's. "Say again, Sergeant? A fire solution? From who?" Rourke did not answer immediately. Clara Voss had moved. She had moved to the rear of the convoy, to a position at the left side of the rear vehicle where the hull angle gave her approximately 6 additional inches of elevated sight line. She was assembling something not from her standard kit, but from a case she had been carrying that Rourke had assumed was additional equipment. It was a rifle, not a standard issue model, something longer, something that had been carefully disassembled and equally carefully kept out of direct sight since they deployed. Rourke walked to her. "Voss, I know," she said, still assembling. "I need to know who you are before I—" "No, you don't." The bolt went home with a clean, final sound. "You need to know whether I can do this. Those are different questions. Then answer the second one." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I can do this." He stood there in the white salt storm with the shots still coming in unpredictable intervals and 3 people bleeding behind him and made a decision. He keyed the radio. "All elements, stand by. We have a fire solution. Shooter has a call sign." He looked at her. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Desert Serpent." He repeated it into the radio. "Call sign Desert Serpent. She has the shot." The channel went silent. Then Webb's voice. "Sergeant, did you just say?" "I said stand by." "Webb." Another shot came in from the white. Wide of anyone, but close enough to hear. They were running out of time before the shooter reached elevation. "I need 15 minutes, she said. "You said 12. The wind shifted. 14. I need to verify the secondary calculation. If you miss, I know what happens if I miss. She settled into position, adjusting the rifle's angle with movements that were not the careful movements of a trainee. They were the movements of someone who had made exactly this kind of calculation many times. "Go back to your people, Sergeant." He didn't move immediately. "One more shot comes in and I'm pulling everyone back and we lose the window." "I know." 2 minutes passed. Then Kellerman caught a grazing hit, already wounded, now re-hit on the same side, and his cry cut through the storm, and Rourke heard Webb on the radio. "Sergeant, I am recommending we pull back to the vehicles and wait out the storm. We cannot sustain." Rourke keyed the radio. "Desert Serpent, you have authorization. Take the shot when ready." Here is what nobody else in the platoon understood, and what Clara Voss did not explain. The shooter was not visible. Had not been visible since the storm began. She was not aiming at a person. She was aiming at a calculation. She had been building the calculation since they entered grid 779er. It started with the wind. The storm was strong, but it was not complex. It had a single dominant direction with a secondary gust pattern overlaid on it, cycling approximately every 40 seconds. She had been counting the cycles since the storm hit. She had the frequency, the variance, the mean. It continued with the shots. 3 shots, 3 data points. Each shot had come from a position she could not see but could infer. From the direction of the sound, adjusted for the delay introduced by the salt crystals in the air, which scatter sound in a way that most people do not account for, from the angle at which each round had struck. She had looked at each impact site, from the pattern of re-entry shadows in the salt surface. It was not guesswork. It was a model. She had a position estimate accurate to approximately 12 meters. In standard conditions, at the range she was working with something in the range of 3,600 yards. She estimated, based on the sound delay calculation, a 12-meter positional error was too large. You would miss, but the target was climbing at a pace she had estimated from the change in shot origin between the second and third rounds. Climbing toward a position that was not 12 meters of uncertainty but a known point, the highest elevation on the northeast ridge that provided cover, the only place on that ridge where a trained shooter would stop, the same place she would have stopped. She was not aiming at where the target was. She was aiming at where the target would be. Range: approximately 3,620 yards. Wind speed at surface: 34 miles per hour, gusting to 47. Wind speed at elevation: this was an estimate, but she had the storm's behavior profile from watching how the salt crystals moved at 3 distinct heights visible to her: approximately 28 miles per hour, steadier. Temperature at surface: 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity: negligible. Air density correction: calculated. The rifle was familiar in her hands. Not this specific rifle, she had assembled it from components, and it was well maintained but not perfectly tuned. But rifles of this type, at this weight, with this balance, her body remembered it the way a body remembers a fluency. She made one final adjustment to the elevation dial, not because the calculation was uncertain, but because the calculation had to account for the rifle's specific wear pattern, which she had assessed during assembly, a few thousandths of an inch, invisible to most people, not to her. She slowed her breathing. She did not rush. Rushing at this range is a different kind of miss, more expensive and harder to explain. She let 2 full breathing cycles pass. She let a gust cycle complete. She felt the secondary wind pattern assert itself exactly as the model said it would. She pressed the trigger in the narrow window between her own heartbeats. The sound of it went into the storm, and the storm took it. It was not a loud sound from where the other soldiers were. The storm was louder. The shot was a hard, flat crack that existed for a fraction of a second and then was absorbed by the white. Inside the lead vehicle, where Hartley had taken cover, the sound registered as just another noise in a situation full of noise. Webb, near the center of the convoy, heard it and thought it was an incoming round. He instinctively pressed lower. Briggs, who had been in enough situations to know the difference between incoming and outgoing, paused, turned his head slightly, said nothing. Rourke heard it from approximately 8 meters behind her position. He had stayed. He had not been able to make himself go back to the convoy. He stood with his back against the rear vehicle's hull and felt the shot's concussive pressure against his face. Not strong, at this range, but present, and said nothing. Nothing moved. The storm did not stop. The wind did not ease. The salt continued to scour everything it touched. The white did not part to reveal the result. There was no confirmation sound from the direction of the northeast ridge. No secondary noise. Nothing to hear that would tell them anything. He counted. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. The radio crackled. Webb again. "Sergeant, what is the status of the fire solution? We need to know if." Rourke keyed it off. 30 seconds. Clara Voss had not moved. She remained in position, the rifle still at rest against her shoulder, not because she was preparing a second shot. The angle of her body was too relaxed for that, but because she was listening. Reading the storm's feedback the way a doctor reads a patient's vital signs after a procedure. 40 seconds. The incoming fire did not resume. Rourke had been counting incoming shot intervals since the second round. The longest gap had been 6 minutes, early in the engagement. But this was different. This was the absence of something that had been present. The way a sound you didn't notice you were tracking stops, and the silence it leaves behind feels louder than the sound did. 50 seconds. He found himself breathing again. The storm broke 22 minutes later. It did not taper, it stopped, with the abrupt quality of something switched off, the way weather behaves in that part of the dead zone where the flats meet the lower ridge country and the thermal patterns do things that meteorologists have not fully mapped. The light came back. The white-on-white world resolved back into a world with color, or at least the pale suggestion of color. Bone-gray sky, white salt, brown, black ridge lines, olive-drab vehicles, uniformed figures standing up slowly from covered positions and looking around at each other. Nobody was shooting. Rourke walked the perimeter. He counted personnel. He assessed the wounded Stiles, Kellerman, and a third soldier named Avery who had caught a piece of something during the storm that nobody had seen happen and who had sat quietly against a tire for 30 minutes without saying anything. He made the radio work again by the simple mechanism of removing the comms specialist's hands and doing it himself, isolating the interference source, which turned out to be a metal panel in the lead vehicle that had been vibrating against the antenna mount in a way that blocked the specific frequency range. It took 8 minutes. When he reached command, the first thing command said was, "We've been trying to reach you for 90 minutes. We had interference," Rourke said. "We have 3 wounded, ambulatory. The listening post has been cleared of data. We have a hostile contact situation that is now resolved. Requesting immediate extract." "What do you mean, resolved?" Rourke thought about how to answer that. "I mean the shooting stopped," he said. "Command sent a drone. Not immediately 40 minutes, which was the transit time from the nearest forward position. When the drone reached the northeast ridge and swept the elevated position, the image it sent back showed what Clara Voss's calculation had predicted. The highest covered position on the ridge's southern spine, a natural stone shelf approximately 2 meters wide, partially enclosed. One figure, no longer presenting a threat. The drone pilot's voice on the radio was professionally flat. "Target at northeast ridge elevation is confirmed inactive. 1 individual. No movement. Confirm fire solution effective." The platoon heard this over the open channel. There was a silence after it that lasted perhaps 6 seconds. Not an uncomfortable silence, a specific kind of silence that happens when a group of people all need a moment to relocate themselves in relation to what has just happened. Webb said, "Finally, who made that shot?" Rourke was standing near the rear of the convoy. He looked toward the position Clara Voss had taken. She was not there. He turned. She was 20 meters away, on the far side of the convoy, disassembling the rifle with the same efficient movements she had used to assemble it. She was not watching the drone feed. She was not looking in the direction of the ridge. Her attention was entirely on the components in her hands. "Voss," Webb said, walking toward her. His voice had a quality it hadn't had before, not exactly respect, not exactly wariness, somewhere between them. "What the hell just happened?" She placed the last component into its case and closed it. "The shooting stopped," she said. "The extract took 3 hours from the moment the drone confirmed the situation." In those 3 hours, Rourke did something he had not done in the field in a long time. He sat down and pulled up a file on a device that was not supposed to be used for personnel review in the field and read it very carefully. Clara Voss. The file was not the file that had come with her transfer papers. That file was a single page, thin, mostly redacted. The file Rourke found required the kind of access code that Rourke should not technically have had but had been given by a senior officer 6 years ago with the instruction that it was for emergencies, and this was the first time he had used it. The real file was 47 pages. He read the first 12 before the extract helicopters were close enough to warrant standing up. Her actual service record started not 3 months ago when she had been attached to 3rd Platoon as a trainee. It started 9 years ago. It started in a different name, a name he didn't recognize, but that appeared at the top of a series of after-action reports that were themselves classified at a level several steps above where Rourke normally operated. She had been a sniper specialist. The file used the word specialist in the way the military uses it to describe people whose particular capabilities are exceptional enough to require special handling, not exceptional in the way that a very good marksman is exceptional. Exceptional in the way that requires a separate administrative category. The call sign Desert Serpent appeared in the file 4 times. Each instance was cross-referenced to a separate incident report. The first 3 were operations that had concluded successfully in ways that the language of official reports is not designed to fully capture. The 4th cross-reference led to an after-action report that was entirely redacted, not partially, not with individual lines blocked out, but entirely black-paged, every word, every date, every geographic reference. Below the 4th cross-reference, there was a single line: personnel status, non-operational. Reason, see sealed record, and below that, a reassignment date. The reassignment that had sent her to 3rd Platoon. The classification on the reassignment order was the second highest Rourke had ever seen on a personnel document. It had been signed by 2 people. One was an officer whose name Rourke recognized as a figure from a division briefing 2 years ago. The other was a name he did not recognize, which in Rourke's experience meant a name he was not supposed to recognize. He sat with the file and thought about a 23-year-old girl who had arrived at his convoy 3 days ago with a 2-new uniform and 2 careful hands, and had stood at the rear of the vehicle looking at a point 40 degrees northeast, and not needing a compass. He thought about the word trainee. He thought about the word non-operational. He thought about a rifle assembled from components in a case that nobody had asked about. The extract helicopters came in low from the southeast, using the ridge line as cover the way any competent pilot would in a denied area, and landed in a tight 2-bird formation 200 meters from the convoy. The wounded went first. Stiles was conscious and talking, which was a good sign. Kellerman was quiet, which might or might not be a good sign. Avery had finally allowed the medic to look at her arm and was expressing opinions about the situation using language that indicated she was going to be fine. The platoon loaded efficiently. Years of training making the boarding of an extract helicopter a thing that happens without verbal coordination, without wasted motion. Soldiers helping other soldiers with the automatic fluency of people who have practiced this until it no longer feels like practice. Rourke was the last officer to board. Before he stepped onto the helicopter, he turned and looked back at the convoy, which would be driven out by a skeleton crew attached to the 2nd helicopter. Clara Voss was standing beside the 2nd helicopter, not yet boarding, looking south. He walked to her. The helicopter noise made normal conversation difficult, so he moved close enough to speak without shouting. She turned to look at him. Her expression was the same expression it had been since he had first seen her, that specific quality of calm that was not the absence of awareness but somehow the opposite of it, a heightened precision that looked like blankness from the outside. "I read part of your file," he said. She nodded once. "The sealed section," he said. "What's in it?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked south again, across the salt flats, in the direction of nothing visible. "Something that used to be there," she said. "That isn't anymore." He thought about asking what that meant. He decided it was a question that wouldn't be answered in a way that would make him feel better about having asked it. "You're not a trainee," he said. "Then why are you here? Why this unit? Why this assignment?" She was quiet for a moment. The helicopter behind them was spinning up, the wash from the rotors beginning to push at them. The salt crystals that covered everything made the air between them sparkle with a fine, cold light. "Because someone decided I should be," she said. "And because your grid reference was on the list." "What list?" She didn't answer that. "Desert Serpent," Rourke said. The call sign felt different in his mouth now than it had on the radio. Heavier. Like a word in a language he was just beginning to understand the grammar of. "The unit it was first attached to," he said. "In your file, there's a line about an entire unit. A disappearance." She looked at him. "That's in the sealed section," she said. "I know." Another pause. The helicopter crew chief was gesturing at her to board. She held up one finger in his direction without looking at him, and he waited. "Sama kumgananghung," she said. The words were in a language that was not English, spoken in the even tone of someone quoting something they have said before, or heard before, or had said to them by someone they could no longer ask. "My old spotter used to say that. He learned it from somewhere. I never found out where." "What does it mean?" She picked up the component case and moved toward the helicopter. "The desert doesn't need heroes," she said. "It only needs survivors." She boarded. The helicopter lifted. Rourke stood on the salt for a moment longer, watching it clear the ridge line and bank south. The salt storm had left a fine white residue on every surface of every vehicle, on the equipment, on the weapons, on the ground, on everything. He looked northeast, toward the ridge where the drone had confirmed the inactive target. The light was different now that the storm had passed. The reflection angles were back to what the dead zone did in normal conditions, wrong in the ordinary way, not wrong in the specific way Clara Voss had noticed before anyone else. He thought about what she had seen that morning that he hadn't. He thought about 9 years of after-action reports, about a sealed record and a name at the top of a reassignment order he was not supposed to be able to read. He thought about a rifle assembled from components in a case and a calculation made in a blinding white salt storm with 3 people bleeding and no working communications and a shooter on an invisible ridge 3.5 miles away. He thought, what else is she carrying that I didn't ask about? He did not have an answer. He boarded the first helicopter. It lifted, banked south, and the Alvarez salt flats shrank below them into white geometry lines and angles that meant nothing from up here, that were just light and salt and shadow. Somewhere in the second helicopter, Clara Voss was sitting with her case on her knee and her hands still and her eyes looking out the window at the same geometry. At what it showed her that it showed nobody else. 3 weeks later, Rourke put in a formal request for her service history. The request was acknowledged. The file he received in response was a single page, mostly redacted. Her name at the top, Clara Voss. The rest, black bars, white space, and at the bottom, a single line that had not been there before. Personnel status, non-operational. Reason, see sealed record. He put the file in a drawer. He left it there. Some doors, he had learned, don't open because they're locked. Some of them don't open because what you find on the other side is something you then have to figure out what to do with. And in a dead zone where the light bounces wrong and the compasses lie and the ground is white all the way to the horizon, the most dangerous thing you can carry is a question that has an answer you're not equipped for. He had enough of those already. The Alvarez salt flats, as Clara Voss understood them, and as the soldiers of 3rd Platoon did not, were not simply a terrain feature. They were an environment with its own physics. Salt flats at extreme elevation and temperature create layered atmospheric conditions that bend light, scatter radio frequencies, and distort sound propagation in ways that standard field manuals do not fully account for. Soldiers trained in conventional desert environments are accustomed to heat shimmer, accustomed to mirages at distance. What they are not accustomed to is a surface that reflects not only visible light but all electromagnetic radiation in a diffuse pattern, creating a zone in which the usual sensory shortcuts that experienced soldiers rely on sound direction, equipment response, the particular way a familiar environment communicates threat are degraded or reversed entirely. Clara Voss had been in a salt flat environment before. Not this one, a different one, in a different part of the world, under a different name, with a spotter who had spent 3 weeks teaching her how to read the specific language of that terrain. The lessons had carried. They do not always carry. Knowledge is often contextual, attached to the specific place and time and person it came from, and when those are removed, the knowledge sometimes goes with them. But the core of what she had learned was not location-specific. It was about the relationship between a particular kind of surface and the light that falls on it, the way shadows behave, the way reflection angles shift depending on what is creating the reflection. She recognized the Alvarez flats' quality of wrongness within the first 10 minutes of entering them, the way the light was wrong, the way the equipment was wrong, the way the convoy's collective attention was pointed in the direction that felt dangerous when the actual danger was coming from a different angle entirely. She noticed all of this and said nothing. This is the part that the other soldiers, afterward, found hardest to understand. Why had she not said something? Why had she watched them walk into something she could see taking shape? The honest answer, and Clara Voss was not in the habit of giving dishonest answers, even when dishonest ones would have been easier, was that she was not certain. She had a strong inference, assembled from fragments of observation and the body knowledge of a person who had stood in many dangerous places and paid attention to what they felt like before they became dangerous. But an inference is not a fact. And she was a trainee in a unit where her standing was zero and her credibility was non-existent, and the single reliable way to destroy whatever small possibility existed that someone might listen to her later was to speak too early, too urgently, about something she could not yet prove. So she waited. She watched the shadows. She counted the angles. She built the picture. And when it was time to speak, she spoke. 3,600 yards. Rourke sat with that number for a long time on the helicopter back to base, long after the extract was complete and the wounded had been transferred to the medical team and the debrief had been scheduled for the following morning. He sat with it, the way you sit with something that doesn't fit in the category you've been using to think about it. 3,600 yards is not a number that appears in the standard field manual section on sniper engagement ranges. It barely appears in the specialized training literature. It is the kind of number that exists at the outermost edge of what the relevant equipment is designed to do in optimal conditions: clear air, stable platform, known and verified target position, no wind of consequence. The Alvarez Flats engagement had been conducted in zero visibility conditions, in wind gusts exceeding 45 miles per hour, from an improvised firing position on a vehicle hull against a target whose position had been entirely inferred. There was a section in Clara Voss's sealed file, the 12 pages Rourke had managed to read in the 3 hours before extract, that used the phrase confirmed engagements outside standard operational parameters without specifying what those parameters were or how far outside them the engagements in question had occurred. He had read that phrase and not fully understood what it was encoding. He understood it now. He also understood, with a clarity that the debrief report he was about to write would not be able to capture, that Clara Voss had not taken that shot because it was the safest option available. She had taken it because it was the only option available, because the alternatives waiting out the storm with 3 wounded and no communications and a shooter who would eventually find elevation and a clear angle had consequences that were worse, and she had done the calculation on those consequences with the same cold precision she had done the calculation on wind speed and target movement and bullet drop. This was, he thought, the thing that the file's bureaucratic language of non-operational and sealed record was really describing. Not an incapacity, not a failure, something more like the opposite of both. Someone, somewhere in the administrative apparatus that had generated that file, had decided that a person with that capability and that precision and that specific kind of judgment was something that required careful handling, something that should be placed, thoughtfully, in the right situations, something that should be attached to a convoy entering a dead zone as a trainee, with a 2-new uniform and a component case that nobody asked about. He did not know whose decision that had been. He did not know whether it was a decision made to protect Clara Voss, to deploy her, or to do something more complicated that combined both purposes. He suspected he would not be given the answer to that question any more than he had been given the answer to any of the other questions. He put his head back against the helicopter's hull and closed his eyes. The rotors said the same thing they always said, which was nothing. Corporal Jess Hartley wrote home that week. He wrote home every week, to his mother in Columbus, Ohio, and to his younger sister Penny, who was 15 and thought military service was romantic in a way that Hartley spent a portion of every letter carefully correcting without making it sound like correction. He did not write about the engagement itself that was classified, and he was disciplined enough to respect that line, but he wrote around it, the way soldiers sometimes do, in the language of the peripheral and the incidental. "We had a complicated day," he wrote. "One of those days where things go wrong and you find out which direction people move when they do. Some people get smaller, some people stay the same, and sometimes someone does something so far outside the category you had them in that you have to just sit with the fact that you had them wrong. We had a new person with us. I thought she was nothing, which is the kind of thing you think when you're not paying enough attention. She wasn't nothing. She was the opposite of nothing in a way I'm still working out how to describe. She saved people. And then she didn't make anything about it. She just put her stuff away and got on the helicopter. I think that's what getting it right looks like. I'm not sure I've seen it before." He sealed the letter and went to find Briggs, who was cleaning his weapon and not talking about what had happened because Briggs processed things through the ritual of maintaining equipment rather than through words. "Hey," Hartley said. Briggs looked up. "I thought she was a reporter," Hartley said. "Embedded." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then, "I thought so too. We were wrong." "Yeah." Briggs ran the cleaning patch through the barrel again, slow and methodical. "What did you think she was? At the end, when she was still sitting there after, just sitting there with the case?" Hartley thought about it. "Someone who's been doing this long enough that the part of it that shakes people doesn't shake her anymore," he said. "Not because she doesn't feel it, but because she's had to figure out where to put it." Briggs nodded slowly. "Desert Serpent," he said, trying the call sign out loud for the first time, hearing what it sounded like as a name rather than a code. "Yeah. You think we'll see her again?" Hartley looked out across the compound toward the flight line, where the helicopters from the extract were being refueled and checked. Clara Voss was not anywhere he could see. "No," he said. "I don't think we will." He was right. The component case was standard issue in size and matte in finish and had no external markings. This was the kind of detail that, in retrospect, told you something if you knew how to read it. Standard issue cases have markings. They have stenciled unit identifiers. They have wear patterns from institutional handling. They have the small scars of many different hands. Clara Voss's case had none of these things. It had the wear patterns of a single pair of hands, maintained with obsessive care, carried close enough to the body that it never bounced against surfaces or scraped against other equipment. It had traveled with her. That was the only accurate way to describe it. The way certain objects travel with certain people, not because they are valuable in a commercial sense, but because they are part of the person's working relationship with the world. After she boarded the extract helicopter and the case went with her, Rourke had thought about the fact that nobody had inspected it. Nobody had asked what was in it when she'd arrived, because she had arrived as a trainee, and trainees are not expected to be carrying specialized equipment that requires a separate administrative category to properly describe. He thought about this, and he thought about the sealed section of her file, and he thought about the name on the second line of the reassignment order. The name he didn't recognize, and he assembled from these fragments a picture that was probably incomplete but was almost certainly pointing in the right direction. Someone had sent her to the convoy, someone who had known what was at grid reference 779er, or who had known that whatever was at grid reference 779er was the kind of thing that required a particular kind of person to be present when the convoy arrived there. He did not know whether that person was protecting 3rd Platoon. He did not know whether that person was using 3rd Platoon. He suspected the honest answer was that it did not matter which one it was, because the outcome was the same either way. 3 wounded soldiers who were alive, a threat that was neutralized, and a convoy that had come home. That had to be enough. That was going to have to be enough. The debrief was the following morning at 0700, in a room that had the particular institutional quality of all debrief rooms. Folding tables, fluorescent light, a whiteboard that still had marks from the previous session that no one had completely erased. Rourke gave the factual account. He used the language of factual accounts, grid references, timestamps, casualty designations, weapon types, and omitted the things that factual accounts are not designed to hold. He described the fire solution as having been executed by an attached personnel specialist operating at the request of the senior NCO. He described the outcome as confirmed effective by drone reconnaissance. He used the call sign Desert Serpent once, in the sentence that explained who had taken the shot, and he did not explain it further. The intelligence officer conducting the debrief wrote it down and looked at it and looked up. "Desert Serpent," she said. "Correct. Can you describe the attached personnel specialist for the record?" Rourke gave the physical description: height, build, hair color, the uniform. The intelligence officer was writing as he spoke, and partway through his description she stopped writing. She was looking at the whiteboard, not at anything written on it. Past it. "Did this personnel specialist identify herself by name?" The intelligence officer said. "Voss," Rourke said. "Clara Voss." The intelligence officer put her pen down. She looked at it on the table. Then she picked it up again and wrote something that she turned face down before Rourke could read it. "Is there anything else pertinent to this engagement that you wish to include in the record?" she said. "No," Rourke said. "Then we're concluded. I'll have the transcript to you for signature by end of week." She stood up, started gathering her materials. Then, with her back turned, not looking at him, "The personnel in this room have no need to discuss the identity of the fire solution operative with anyone outside this debrief. That includes other members of your platoon." "Understood," Rourke said. She left. He sat at the folding table under the fluorescent light and looked at the whiteboard marks from the previous session. Someone had drawn a diagram, lines and circles, partially erased. It could have been a tactical map. It could have been something else entirely. He thought about an intelligence officer who knew what Desert Serpent meant before he finished explaining it. He thought about a reassignment order signed by a name he wasn't supposed to recognize. He thought about the Alvarez salt flats, white and wrong and silent in the morning light, after the storm had passed and the helicopters had gone, and there was nothing left on the northeast ridge but salt and bone-colored sky. He thought, she was never here. He thought, that's the point. He got up and walked out into the compound, and the morning was hot and clear and exactly the right color, and the light bounced off everything at exactly the angles it was supposed to, and all of the compasses were working fine.